On a freezing night in Seattle, as snow fell with a silent fury over the city lights, something extraordinary was about to happen, and no one could have predicted how deeply it would change lives forever. Queen's Mercy Hospital was known for its excellence, but in the early hours of that morning, in the cold corridors of the pediatric ICU, something beyond medicine was at play. It was fate, invisibly stitching together the threads of two broken souls. Emma Taylor was an ordinary nurse, young, dedicated, with deep circles under her eyes and a heart far too big for the uniform she had worn for over 12 hours. She walked out of the hospital, exhausted, longing for the silence of her bedroom and maybe a cup of tea before facing another night at home, where she was also a daughter, a sister, and a caregiver. But as she passed through the hospital's side entrance, what she saw made her freeze in place. A man, covered in snow, sitting on the ground as if frozen in time. He wore expensive clothes, Italian shoes, and an emptiness in his eyes that screamed for help, even without a sound. Without hesitation, Emma took off her coat, despite the cold seeping into her bones, and placed it over his shoulders. She didn't ask who he was or what he was doing there. She simply knelt beside him and murmured, with a tenderness that cut through the stillness of the night, "You're not alone." That moment, so small and simple in the eyes of the world, was the beginning of something no one could have imagined. That man, who hadn't spoken a single word, was Lucas Donovan, the CEO of Helix Corp., one of the most powerful names in the tech industry. A man who had everything, and yet had lost it all. What brought him there wasn't a fainting spell or a sudden accident. It was the weight of pain. Lucas carried the guilt of a tragedy on his shoulders, the loneliness of unprocessed grief, and the desperation of a father watching his daughter lie in a coma, powerless to help. And still, on that freezing night, a nurse, unknown, humble, exhausted, offered him the only remedy science cannot prescribe: human presence. And that was enough for something to start shifting. What followed is a story about reconnection, about unlikely encounters that heal, about a simple home filled with warmth and a corporate empire starved of love. It's a story about a little girl who smiled even with her eyes closed, about paper sunflowers and hot soups, about unspoken words that were still deeply felt, and above all, about new beginnings. If you believe there's no such thing as fate, or if you've ever doubted that small gestures can save someone, maybe this story will make you think again. Because sometimes, all a person needs is for someone to sit beside them on the cold ground and say, "You're not alone." And that's exactly what Emma did. Without knowing that, on that early morning, she hadn't just helped a stranger. She had awakened a sleeping hope, not only in his life, but in hers as well. And now, you're about to discover how that simple act changed everything, forever. The silence of that early morning lingered, heavy and dense like the snow piling up outside. Inside the hospital, under the soft blue glow of the heart monitor, Lucas sat motionless beside his daughter's bed. His eyes didn't move, but his mind spun in endless circles, replaying scenes from a past that haunted him. He was Lucas Donovan, a name that filled magazine covers and business headlines, the tech genius, the man behind Helix Corp., one of the largest innovation companies on the West Coast. But there, in that pediatric ICU, there were no executives, no billion-dollar deals, no investor presentations. There was only a father, desperate, powerless, and shattered. On the bed lay little Chloe, just 7 years old, resting in a coma. A tangle of wires connected her fragile body to machines fighting for her. Her face still held the sweetness of childhood, but the silence coming from her chest was Lucas's greatest nightmare. Just hours before, everything seemed normal. He was in a board meeting when the call came. Chloe had suffered a severe seizure. In minutes, his world collapsed, but that collapse hadn't started there. 2 years earlier, tragedy had struck with brutal force. Anna, his wife, his life partner, died in a helicopter crash while flying to meet him at a conference. He had insisted she come. He wanted to see her, needed her. And afterward, all that was left was a phone call and a sealed casket. Since then, Lucas had hidden in the only place where he still felt in control: work. He buried himself in projects, flights, endless meetings. He left Chloe with nannies, teachers, screens. Over time, he stopped hearing her laughter echo through the house, stopped asking what she felt, what she feared, what she dreamed of. He thought he was protecting them both from pain. But now she was there, silent, absent, and he could no longer pretend to be strong. It was that early morning when Emma returned. She brought with her a warm blanket and a cup of tea. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat beside him, as if she understood that sometimes silence is the only language that fits. Lucas, without knowing exactly why, began to speak, words he had never said aloud. He spoke of the last picture Chloe had drawn, a yellow house with a shaky blue sky. He spoke of the first time he saw Anna and how she laughed at his ridiculous shoes in the university elevator. He spoke of the promises he made to himself as a father and all the ones he had broken. He talked like someone emptying himself out, like someone who needed to confess just to keep breathing. Emma listened attentively. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a calm, steady presence. She didn't offer answers, just listened. And for Lucas, that was more than enough. That morning, as the hospital lights pulsed with a faint rhythm, something began to change. Lucas was no longer just the businessman, the unbeatable CEO, the distant widower. He was just a father trying to hold the world together with trembling hands. And Emma became the first person to truly see the man behind the headlines. And so, between whispered secrets and overdue confessions, an invisible bond began to form. A bond made of shared pain and the silent promise that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to rebuild. Emma Taylor wasn't someone who sought the spotlight or grand achievements. She lived a simple life, filled with quiet responsibilities and a deep love that rarely showed in grand gestures, but revealed itself in the small acts of daily devotion. She lived on the outskirts of Seattle, in a modest 2-story house she shared with her mother Margaret and her little sister Sophie, a 5-year-old girl whose curious eyes and bright spirit mirrored the same spark Emma had carried since childhood. Margaret was a warrior, battling multiple sclerosis with a strength that seemed to rise from her soul. Her body, though frail and weakened, was protected by her daughter's tireless love. Emma had stepped into the role of caregiver almost without noticing, balancing long hospital shifts with sleepless nights filled with medication schedules, home-cooked meals, and bedtime stories for Sophie, who loved imagining magical worlds before falling asleep. The house wasn't large, nor luxurious. Its walls held the warmth of laughter and secrets, of dreams and fears shared in that tight-knit routine. Emma never complained about the weight she carried. For her, beauty was in the details, in Sophie's tight hugs, in her mother's peaceful smile, in the smell of freshly brewed coffee each morning. There, even in simplicity, was a home, a refuge where, despite the hardships, love bloomed. At the hospital, Emma was known for her dedication and empathy, but she carried a weariness that went beyond the physical. The 12-hour shifts drained her body, but what truly weighed on her was the constant ache of what she left behind. As she cared for dozens of children, she often wondered how she found the strength to care for her own family. Sophie was full of questions. Why can't Mommy walk? When will Mommy get better? And Emma answered them with all the patience she could gather, even when exhaustion threatened to win. In that routine, Emma had learned to find beauty in imperfection. The house could be messy, the days difficult, but there was love and hope. It was a life made of sacrifices and resilience, where every small victory held immense value. She dreamed of giving Sophie more, of seeing her mother healed, of maybe one day living a less chaotic life. But she knew that getting there would take courage and persistence. Behind that dedicated nurse was a woman who, despite the weight of responsibility, had never lost her gentleness. Emma had a way of soothing not just her patients, but anyone who crossed her path. There was something in her gaze that brought comfort, something many couldn't explain. When she met Lucas that night, Emma had no idea that her life, already full of challenges, was about to turn a new page. She saw in him a man just as broken as she sometimes felt, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt the impulse to care for him too. It was a connection beyond words, made of quiet gestures and a deep understanding of what it meant to be alone, fighting invisible storms. In that small house with its walls full of stories, Emma continued her routine. She cared for her mother with patience and love, played with Sophie between chores and worked at the hospital, where day after day her quiet light illuminated those who needed it most. She didn't yet know that by opening her heart to Lucas, she would also open the door to transformation, to a love that didn't come from fairy tales, but from the real, concrete strength of people who choose to care for one another, even when the world feels like it's falling apart. And it was in that delicate balance between fragility and resilience that Emma moved forward, step by step, living a life that, though simple, was about to become forever intertwined with another, a life marked by pain, but also by the hope of a new beginning. In the days that followed that freezing morning, something subtle and extraordinary began to happen in the quiet room of the pediatric ICU. Chloe, the little girl in a coma, remained surrounded by machines and monitors, tracking each heartbeat, each breath. But despite the stillness, there were signs, tiny movements that seemed to pierce the veil of unconsciousness. Lucas watched it all with a mix of hope and fear. Every movement, every small signal from his daughter felt like a priceless treasure. And in that delicate setting, Emma's presence began to make all the difference. She arrived with her calm, steady demeanor, with a patience that seemed endless, bringing not just medical care, but a human warmth that softened the sterile air of the room. The bond between Emma and Chloe was quiet, but powerful. Emma knew that even in a coma, children could sense their surroundings. So she spoke gently, touched the girl's hand with care, and encouraged the smallest responses. Things that might seem insignificant to others. But to Lucas, who saw through the eyes of a desperate father, each soft squeeze of Chloe's hand was an immense victory. It was Emma who noticed, on the second day, a nearly invisible gesture. Chloe gently squeezed her finger. It was a fragile sign, but a clear one. Emma held the girl's hand tenderly, encouraging her to keep trying, not to give up. She brought a paper sunflower, handmade by her little sister Sophie, and placed it in the window of the room. The sunflower, a symbol of light and hope, seemed to carry a silent message for Chloe. And then, something that once seemed impossible happened. Chloe, even without opening her eyes, gave a faint smile, a subtle movement, yet enough to shatter the heavy silence that hovered in the room. Lucas, sitting beside her, saw that smile and felt a lump rise in his throat, a mix of overwhelming emotion and relief that nearly brought him to tears. It was as if, in that moment, Emma's presence had awakened something within the little girl. Hope, long dormant, began to take form. Lucas, who had felt lost and powerless for so long, now found himself touched not only by his daughter's slight improvement, but by the strength and tenderness of the woman who seemed to carry a sliver of light with her. Days passed, and that simple gesture, a smile, became a silent promise for everyone in that room. Chloe was not alone. There were hands holding her, voices surrounding her, hearts beating in rhythm with hope. And Emma, with her calm and steady demeanor, became the bridge between that world of machines and the real world, between pain and the possibility of healing. Though still immersed in the pain of loss and the weight of guilt, Lucas began to see life from a new perspective. Emma's presence, the gentle care she offered, the silent love that overflowed in every gesture, was enough to reignite in him something he thought he had lost forever: faith in the future. That hospital room, once a place of despair, began to transform. The paper sunflower in the window became a daily reminder that life, even in its hardest moments, could still bloom. And among machines, Beeping monitors and quiet glances, a family slowly began to rebuild, piece by piece, smile by smile. Chloe, even in her fragility, was the beating heart of that transformation. Her slow, faint smile, proof that light still lived inside her, illuminated not only the ICU, but also the hearts of those who refused to give up, who believed that no matter how long the night, morning would always come. It was night once again, and the Seattle sky released a light rain, as if trying to silently wash away the lingering pain spread across the city. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was calm. Chloe slept peacefully, her vitals steady, while Lucas remained at her side, just as he had every day since she was admitted. But that night, something different happened. After checking her last charts, Emma softly mentioned that she needed to go straight home. "My mom had a hard day, and Sophie's waiting for dinner. It's soup tonight. Nothing fancy," she said with a shy smile, placing the clipboard back on the counter. Lucas, still lost in thought, surprised even himself with his reply. "Let me drive you. It's late and it's raining." Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded without fuss. On the drive, the car moved quietly through the damp streets, lit only by lampposts and shop windows slowly dimming for the night. They didn't say much, but the silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It had become a space of understanding, where even unspoken words carried weight. When they arrived, Emma invited him upstairs. "If you're not in a rush, there's still time for a bowl of soup." Lucas, caught off guard, gave a soft smile. He accepted. The modest home Emma lived in carried a warmth that was hard to explain. There was something there Lucas hadn't felt in a long time. Home. A place that breathed affection. Drawings were taped to the walls. Hand-embroidered dish towels hung in the kitchen. Children's books were stacked in various corners, and the sound of a tiny, excited voice echoed from the hallway. Sophie ran to the door as soon as she heard footsteps. Her eyes lit up at the sight of her sister, and then froze curiously on Lucas. Like a little hostess, she handed him a paper sunflower hastily made with glue and love. "Do you want to have dinner with us?" she asked, flashing a full-toothed grin. In the kitchen, Margaret sat tired but serene. Her thinning hair and time-worn face told the story of illness and endurance, but her eyes still held life. She told old stories while Emma served the soup, and Lucas, seated at the table, found himself watching it all, as if he had stepped into a gentle dream. Dinner was simple: vegetables, day-old bread, hot tea, but the table was alive. Sophie hummed as she colored with crayons. Emma chuckled softly at her little sister's jokes. Margaret spoke of her youth as if time had never passed. And Lucas simply listened. He felt his chest warm in a way it hadn't in years. At one point, he looked around and realized there was something here no amount of money could ever buy. It was peace. It was that feeling of belonging, of not needing to pretend to be strong, of simply being. And then, without warning, with tears in his eyes, he said, "I don't think I've ever felt this much peace." The words came out naturally, and as he spoke them, Lucas realized they were true. After years of hiding behind numbers and meetings, he had found in that modest home something that no luxury could ever offer: human warmth. Emma, hearing his words, simply smiled. She didn't say anything, but inside, something shifted too. That night, between spoonfuls of soup and effortless conversation, fate sealed another step. The lonely CEO and the devoted nurse were drawing closer, not by coincidence, but because in the chaos of life, sometimes two broken souls recognize each other, and they find in one another exactly what they didn't know they were searching for. The following weeks brought a new routine, delicate, quiet, but profoundly transformative. What had once been despair and distance began to give way to small gestures that revealed a man rediscovering his role in his daughter's life. Lucas Donovan, the relentless CEO, now arrived at the hospital not as an executive, but as a father. He came early, his eyes less burdened with guilt, his shoulders a little lighter. He spent hours by Chloe's side, holding her hand, reading stories with a voice still hesitant but increasingly tender. Emma watched from a distance, between shifts, how his constant presence brought healing to them both. With every new drawing, every involuntary movement Chloe made, Lucas poured more of himself into that healing process, one not born from machines or diagnoses, but from love, presence, and daily devotion. Emma, while keeping some emotional distance, couldn't ignore what was unfolding before her. Lucas was beginning to understand the value of what he once overlooked. He began stopping by her home, sometimes with books for Margaret, other times with educational games for Sophie. He took Sophie to the park, held her small hand with a gentleness that contrasted with the businessman everyone knew. Sophie, in her spontaneous way, called him Lulu and had become his little shadow. He laughed with her about silly things, colored with markers, helped with homework, even when he didn't understand it. Margaret, despite her physical limits, came to see him as a quiet friend, someone who offered help without overstepping. There was, finally, trust. But it was Chloe who once again broke the silence with the strength of someone who loves without words. One day during a visit, she had her eyes open, still drowsy but alert. Her fingers held a pencil, gently guided by Emma's hand as they drew together. The page was blank, nearly colorless, until a drawing appeared, a house with 3 people: Chloe, her dad, and Emma. Above the picture, in shaky but clear childlike handwriting, "My new family." Lucas held the paper with trembling hands. The silence that followed settled like a calm wave, dense, yet full of meaning. He didn't know what to say. Emma didn't either. But in their eyes was something stronger than words. It was recognition. It was gratitude. It was an invisible bond being stitched together with tenderness and hope. From that day on, Lucas began to change even more. He no longer wore dark suits but simple, comfortable clothes. He learned how to braid his daughter's hair, uneven braids that made the hospital staff smile. He even decorated her room with Chloe's drawings, many of them filled with sunflowers. He had traded graphs for colored pencils, emails for handwritten letters to his daughter, spreadsheets for afternoons spent watching cartoons with Sophie. He was a man in the process of healing, and every small gesture seemed to mend a piece of himself that had been broken for years. Emma watched it all with a mix of surprise and affection. The man she had met, covered in snow and silence, now smiled with ease. And even though she didn't know what the future would bring, she knew something had changed forever. Chloe, with her gentle spirit, had done more than recover. She had brought together fragments of broken lives, drawn a possible family, and filled what was once gray with the colors of love. And so, through crayons, park strolls, and simple dinners at the table, the days went on. Small, deep, and genuine transformations, reshaping lives that had once lost all hope of starting over. At dusk, as the sun disappeared behind Seattle's skyline, Emma arrived home, holding an envelope in her hands. It had been left in the mailbox, no sender, only her name written in firm, elegant handwriting. She held it with a sense of hesitation, as if she already knew it contained something far greater than a simple piece of paper. Inside was a single folded note, carefully placed beside a receipt. The paper trembled between her fingers as she slowly read the words that pierced straight through her soul. For the one who cared for my soul when all I wanted was to disappear. Lucas. The attached receipt confirmed something almost unbelievable. Margaret's surgery had been fully paid for. A costly operation, long stalled in the public system queue, waiting for an opening, a chance, a miracle. And now, quietly, someone had made the impossible happen. Emma collapsed onto the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, as a wave of emotion swept over her. Silent, warm tears ran down her face. She clutched to her chest the jacket Lucas had forgotten at their house weeks earlier. The one Sophie insisted was magic, because it smelled like good things. She knew it had to be him. Lucas hadn't said a word about it. No mention, no hint of his generosity. And perhaps that was what moved her the most. He didn't act for recognition. He wasn't seeking gratitude. He did it because he felt it, because he understood, perhaps more than anyone, what it meant to carry the weight of the world alone. In the days that followed, the confirmation of the surgery transformed Emma's daily life. The medical team began urgent preparations, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret smiled with hope in her eyes. Sophie excitedly told everyone her mom was going to be new again, as if it were part of a fairy tale. But Emma knew this wasn't a fantasy, it was real, and the hero of this story didn't wear a cape. He wore suits he no longer cared about, and quiet smiles that said more than 1,000 words. Emma tried to thank him, tried to find the right moment to speak to Lucas about the note, the gesture, but every time she saw him, with Chloe, helping Sophie draw, chatting with her mother, she realized that maybe words weren't necessary. There was a quieter language between them, made of glances, of silences full of meaning, of small actions that, together, built something far greater than gratitude. And Lucas, in turn, seemed increasingly at ease in a world so different from the one he once knew. It was as if, little by little, he was taking off the armor he had built over the years. He was letting go of the executive, the public figure, and embracing the father, the friend, the human being still learning how to live with his heart exposed. Chloe continued to recover. Each day, she was more alert, more present. She began to speak in short sentences, smiled more often, asked to hear her favorite stories, and in each of these small victories, there was the imprint of the hope that Emma had helped plant. The letter that arrived unannounced was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was a turning point, a quiet recognition that sometimes the people who save us are simply those who stood by our side at the right moment, expecting nothing in return. Emma tucked the note away in the bottom drawer of her dresser, among the most precious things she owned. Because on that piece of paper, there were more than just words. There was a heart opening, with humility and tenderness, to someone who had taught it how to feel again. The hall of the restored old library in the heart of Seattle was softly lit, with lights strung between wooden beams that carried the weight of time. The walls, once lined with shelves, now displayed photos of parents and children sharing tender moments. It was the official launch of Chloe's Light, a foundation created by Lucas Donovan with a simple but profound mission to help single parents reconnect with their children. Lucas stood there before dozens of guests, journalists, partners, and curious visitors. But he no longer had the posture of the businessman he once was. There was no arrogance, no coldness. He wore simple clothes, his beard unshaven, his eyes calm, and his speech prepared, not on paper, but in his heart. As he stepped onto the stage, he looked at the audience, then at Chloe, seated in the front row beside Emma, holding a paper sunflower in her hands. The same one she'd insisted on carrying since the day she started speaking again. "For a long time," he began, "I believed that success would make me invincible. That if I could prove to the world how strong I was, I wouldn't have to face what was breaking me inside. And that almost cost me what was most valuable to me." The room fell silent. There was truth in his voice, the kind of truth that strips away people's armor and makes them feel. "After I lost my wife, I lost myself too. And without realizing it, I stopped seeing the incredible girl my daughter is. I stopped hearing her laughter, her fears, her silences. But fortunately, I was given a second chance. Thanks to people who didn't give up on me, even when I had already given up on everything." At that moment, his eyes met Emma's. She smiled with that quiet expression he knew so well and simply nodded. No words were needed. Lucas went on. He spoke about how the idea for the foundation came from his desire to prevent other parents from making the same mistakes. That no one should have to wait for pain to understand the value of presence, of affection, of time shared. When he finished, the audience applauded. Not with overwhelming excitement, but with the kind of reverence given to someone who speaks from the soul. That night, Chloe's Light was more than just an organization. It was a symbol of surrender and new beginnings. Emma was one of the honored guests. Her name was mentioned more than once during the event, though she remained quietly distant from the spotlight. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair gently tied back, and her hands interlaced with Chloe's, who never let go of her paper sunflower for even a second. After the event, Lucas walked toward her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, as if everything had already been said. But there was something new in his eyes, a different kind of peace than when he first sat in her house, in front of a bowl of warm soup. It was as if he had finally found his place in the world. They didn't talk much. Sophie ran up to them with her usual excitement, asking if dinner was going to be pasta, and if Lucas could sleep over again. Emma laughed, and Lucas, crouching down to her height, replied, "If I'm invited, of course." In that moment, between the child's sweetness, the gentle glow of the lights, and the soft music filling the corners of the library, one thing became clear. Love didn't need to be announced with grand words. It was there, in the small gestures, in the glances, in the slow and patient building of something new. What had begun as an act of kindness had quietly grown into something neither of them expected. Love, whole, mature, and calm. A love that didn't arrive to fill in empty spaces, but to add strength, to show that even among ruins, it's still possible to build a home. Winter still blanketed Seattle with its silent presence. But that morning, something was different in the air. The sky, though clouded, allowed shy beams of light to slip through the gray, casting a gentle glow on the garden of Queen's Mercy Hospital, where snow still covered the ground in soft layers. It was there, among trees and white-covered benches, that a new scene unfolded. A scene of new beginnings. Chloe walked slowly, her small steps still uncertain, but steady. Her hair, once hidden beneath the sheets of an ICU bed, now danced lightly in the breeze. In her hands, she held a carefully kept gift, a new paper sunflower, colored with crayons and decorated with glitter. She approached Emma, who waited kneeling at the girl's eye level, her eyes full of tenderness. "Can you be my mommy now?" Chloe asked, with the raw sweetness of someone speaking directly from the heart. The silence that followed was instant and powerful. Time seemed to stop for Emma. It wasn't just a question, it was an invitation, a calling, a quiet confession of love. She smiled, eyes brimming with tears, and before she could even respond with words, Lucas appeared behind her and gently placed his coat over Emma's shoulders. The same gesture she had once made for him on that frozen night, months before, when she found him lost at the hospital's doorstep. Nothing more needed to be said. The answer was already given. Texto Padrão. The three of them embraced right there, in the middle of the snow-covered hospital garden. There was no audience, no speeches, no applause. Just the sound of the wind, the beating of three hearts in sync, and the silent warmth of a new family being formed under the eyes of fate. That day they walked together, father, daughter, and the woman who had arrived with no promises, but who brought everything: healing, affection, lightness, and restoration. They passed the same bench where Lucas had once sat, wrapped in snow and silence. Emma looked at him and smiled as if both understood, without needing to say it, that everything had started there. Chloe, with her usual spontaneity, began to hum a song Sophie had taught her. The off-key notes echoed between the trees, and Emma joined in, shyly, with Lucas laughing behind them, singing even more off-key. Later that afternoon, as they returned home, Emma's modest house no longer seemed the same. It had become an expanded home. Margaret, now recovering from surgery, sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the scene with shining eyes. Sophie ran to Chloe. The two embraced, then started playing with cloth dolls on the living room rug, as if it had always been that way. Emma and Lucas stood side by side, watching the girls. He gently reached for her hand, as if asking for permission to stay. She didn't let go. Life hadn't become perfect. There were still worries, hard nights. But there was also something new, something stronger than any obstacle: belonging. Each one of them, Emma, Lucas, Chloe, Sophie, Margaret, had gone through loss, pain, and emptiness. But now they were united not by duty, but by choice. In the days that followed, the paper sunflower Chloe had given Emma was placed in a frame and hung on the living room wall, beside Sophie's drawings and old family photos. A simple yet eternal symbol of everything they had lived through, and everything still to come. Texto Padrón. Because love, when born from courage and surrender, blooms even in the heart of winter. And there, among paper sunflowers, homemade soup, giggles on the couch, and hugs warmer than any blanket, a new story had taken root. Not the story of a perfect family, but of a real one, stitched together with affection, healing, and a kind of love no one else could explain. So, did your heart feel a little warmer on the other side of the screen? Because over here, even the paper sunflower got emotional. If this story touched you in any way, if it made your eyes sparkle, brought a smile to your face, or even drew out one of those warm, quiet tears, then you already know what to do, right? Hit that like button as if you're holding Emma's hand on that freezing night. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Because here, my friend, emotions are served in generous spoonfuls, always with a side of warm soup, of course. Oh, and now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know where all these kind souls are tuning in from, the ones who, just like Lucas, discovered that sometimes all we really need is someone to say, "You're not alone." We'll see you in the next video, with more twists, more smiles, more love, and who knows, maybe even more sunflowers. Until then,